ought to be in pictures. You're wonderful to see. You ought to be in pictures.
Welcome to Deep Dive Movie Reviews with my friend Steve Hackman and myself, James Marsh. This week, we are looking at Season 5 of The Crown.
Hey, but before we talk The Crown, if you haven't already subscribed to Deep Dive Movie Reviews, it'd be a great favor to us if you went ahead and hit that subscribe button. While you're there, why don't you go ahead and like it? And that way the analytics will pick up and it'll spread it out to a wider audience, which we would sure appreciate. And just as a reminder, Deep Dive Movie Reviews does contain spoilers. And so if you don't want any spoilers about Season 5 of The Crown, go watch it first before coming back. James?
Right, so I should point out that no, we haven't reviewed seasons 1 to 4 of The Crown, so don't go hunting for those because they haven't. They're not there. But we have seen it all, and we've both been big fans of The Crown since it came out. And with this new season, we thought, well, why not just dig into it and just sing its praises, criticisms, and what have you, where we see fit. We might even dip into some of the older seasons as we go along. Let's see what happens. So, Steve, we need to probably start with this fact that you're an American, but
Yes.
So what are you doing watching The Crown?
Oh, I think regular listeners to Deep Dive Movie Reviews know that although I play the Yankee, you play the Brit, scratch the surface, I'm an Anglophile, and Her Majesty the Queen. Oh, I can't now. His Majesty the King. Sorry, I'm still getting used. I'm getting used to the change. You know, it's my whole lifetime. Queen Elizabeth's been on the throne. But to answer your question, I just ever since I first went to the UK in 1997 for my 5th wedding anniversary with my wife Tammy, we have loved the country. I think even before I visited there, I grew up in a very Anglophile house. You know, I remember being 12, 13, 14 years old when Charles and Diana were married, and we all got up at 4 a.m. Detroit time, went downstairs, and the family watched Charles and Diana getting wed. You know, that was the family I came from. And so watching The Crown from season 1 to season 5 has been a must. It goes without saying in the Hackman household.
Okay, yeah. I mean, and you're not alone. You know, I'm very aware that there's this huge kind of Anglophile base in the US, and they just love it all. In particular, the royal family. I guess it's a novelty. It's not something that you have there, and it's kind of this crazy ongoing family soap opera, and that's what The Crown has put on screen.
Well, here's my theory to this, James, and this gets a little off tangent, but I think our listeners, if you're listening to this for The Crown, I think you'll appreciate this. You know, some of my Canadian friends and some of my Australian friends or New Zealand friends, they can have a bit of a love-hate relationship with the monarchy because they might like Elizabeth, but you know, we should have our own head of state. We shouldn't have these ties to the UK anymore. We should venture out and be independent like America does. America, we went independent 220 some years ago, and I liken it to the older son or daughter that's moved out, and they love coming back to visit mom and dad because you know, they don't have to live in the house anymore. They can leave when they want. They can just enjoy all the best aspects of mom and dad and then go. But kind of New Zealand and Canada and Australia, they're still kind of living in mom and dad's house. They've got their own room, but and so they kind of bristle. They're like, and I think once they eventually get their full independence, which I think in the fullness of time will happen, there'll be this great love again, like Americans have for the motherland. That's my theory.
It was fascinating to see all of those old sort of conversations about sort of the Commonwealth and colonialism and what have you resurface after the Queen died. And, you know, should we be happy about this? Should we be celebrating this? You know, should we be grieving or celebrating? And, you know, it was fascinating to see it. I mean, obviously, I'm from England, and I spent the first 24 years of my life here, and there is a very sort of interesting relationship or interesting dynamic between the royal family and their subjects, and I think, you know, and I think I'm definitely on the side of, I like them, and I like the fact that we have them. You know, not least they are this sort of great tourist attraction, you know, for the UK. You know, it's the number one reason I think why tourists come to the UK is to see something that is kind of related to the royal family, whether it's Houses of Parliament, whether it's Buckingham Palace or Windsor Castle or whatever it is, or go to the Tower of London, see the crown jewels, or, you know, all the pageantry, and it's just sort of living history I think,
Yes.
in a way that so few other sites are. And obviously there's always a debate about how much we should be spending on them, how much of our tax money should be going and all the rest of it. But I think I'd rather have them than not have them, quite frankly.
Yeah.
It's
I think
something, it's
all
very much
those
something that identifies England and has done for so many years, has done for like 1,000 years. In our history, all we learn about is just the kings and the queens of England, and the political dynamics that they interwove with other countries in Europe. The number of politically motivated marriages there were over the years.
Sure.
It's in and of itself, it's fascinating, and to see that just nixed and done away with just on a kind of on a whim, really, just on a piece of contemporary sentiment, I think would be a real shame, because I think in the fullness of time it is something that really comes to identify Britain as a nation, and long may it continue.
Well, that's kind of the running theme, particularly in season 5 of The Crown, is what happens in the country happens in the royal family, and what happens in the royal family happens in Britain. Made me think of John Borman's Excalibur, and that the land only flourished when the king flourished, and when the king was not flourishing, the land didn't flourish. And they kind of borrow a little from that trope I think in season 5. They really try to cement that this family is the personification of the nation. Sometimes it can be a little soap opera-y, it can be a little melodramatic, but that's definitely the message I feel season 5 is trying to communicate.
Yeah, no, I think that's something that they've been sort of hammering home since the very beginning, and trying to humanize the queen, who is the crown, who is the sovereign, who is the nation. She is this person, but she is this role more than anything else, and that she obviously, it's about her living her life, dedicating her life to service and to duty.
That just made me think of the moment in her funeral that was the most memorable for me. I don't know if it's the most touching, but the most memorable moment I had was I learned something that I had never heard before, probably because I haven't lived to see an English monarch die. But I don't know if you remember, right when they're getting ready to put her in the ground at the very end, the one, I don't know if it's not a guard, but I think it's from the Church of England, comes up and breaks the royal staff, and not MC, you don't have an MC at a the narrator, the spokesman on the BBC was explaining that was the symbol of her being like the head of of her being the queen, that now she is no longer the queen of Great Britain, and she goes to heaven and to God as a humble soul. Now that divinity has been stripped from her, and now she goes humbly to her God. I forgot the exact verbiage, but I remember it being very meaningful and very poignant for me. And and that kind of essence is propelled throughout this whole, not just season 5, but the whole series. Is, even though we all know divinity is not part of this anymore, it still kind of is.
Yeah, she's still defender of the faith of the Church of England. There's that great moment in season 5 when William is kind of signing in to Eton College, and there's obviously a space for religion, and he kind of looks back over his shoulder at his parents. He's like, "Religion? What do I put?" And he's like, and they like roll their eyes and go, "Church of England, you'll be the head of it one day." And one of many moments where they do kind of humanize these elements. But you're right, one of the big themes throughout season 5 is, do we still need a monarchy? And there was this growing sentiment. It was a question that was growing in volume, if nothing else, throughout the UK during sort of the 90s. It was becoming increasingly aware of the financial burden that they were. The Queen seemed to be getting old, and a lot of this season is about Charles getting itchy, getting antsy, and kind of thinking, okay, well, it's my turn. Should you still be carrying on the way you're carrying on, or is there, a scenario where you would abdicate and pass on the baton to me while I'm in my prime and I've got all these great ideas? And so much of this season is about Charles trying to perpetuate this image of himself that he has, that he is this kind of
Yes,
dynamic, forward-thinking, groovy
innovator,
kind of innovator, which he isn't, but he is how he perceives himself. And so he's always courting kind of the Prime Minister, John Major, or whomever, to see if he can get the political backing perhaps necessary to topple his mother. And it was interesting watching that, knowing in that moment that he had literally only just achieved the goal, that here he was in the very early 90s, late 80s, early 90s, scrambling to try and galvanize support for. And you're like, wow, it's really going to be like another 30 years until that happens.
It was, we get the benefit of hindsight. We know exactly at this point now how long he'll wait. We didn't know in season 4, but we know in season 5, how long it would be. But, I think we need to raise the issue that I think this season, more than the previous seasons, there's been a bit of a outcry that the license, I think everybody acknowledged that license is going to be, liberties and are going to be taken in this kind of dramatization. But there's a feeling that lines were crossed in this season, that particularly the issue that you're mentioning, there's not a lot of evidence that Charles was trying to get his mom to abdicate so that he could go to the throne, and was trying to get a coalition. That seems to have had a number of people saying bullshit, and so it becomes the question of what is artistic license. We had this conversation when we watched Spencer. When you're using real people, how much license are you allowed?
Well, I think part of the reason why people are talking about it now is that just generally the audience of this show are more familiar with this time period. When you're talking about like what was going on in the 50s and the 60s, it's like most of the people watching The Crown don't remember any of that, and the documentation surrounding those events was far more, and the access to the royal family back then was far more limited compared to obviously in the 80s and the 90s. And one of the other big themes about in this season particularly is the royal family's relationship with media and with the press and with exposure, be it putting satellite TV into into Buckingham Palace, or tell-all books from Princess Diana coming out, and tapped phones and all the rest of it, and that article that appeared in the Sunday Telegraph or whatever it was, saying, should the Queen, is her time over, should she abdicate? And the mobilizing of the crew of the yacht to get rid of all copies of the newspaper to make sure that the Queen doesn't see it. So, and I think that is where a lot of this dialogue is coming from this time round. I think the series has probably always taken a fair number of liberties. It's TV, it's not a historical document, but I think people are more and more aware of it, just as it's touching on subjects that they have firsthand experience of and they have firsthand memories of, and they're like, oh well, I do remember that, and that's not exactly how I remember it playing out, or I was alive then and I don't remember hearing anything about this. I mean, I think you have to come to this show with a degree of trust and faith that essentially what they are going to tell you is by and large true. Otherwise, I don't think it would have gotten to the screen. I don't think that they would have been motivated really to tell these sort of fantastical stories, really. I think they're interested in the reality of this family and in the history. I think watching it with a mind to nitpick at what's true and what's not is kind of counterproductive. It's like, why even bother watching it? Because that so much of this show is made up of scenes between Charles and Diana sitting in their front room having an argument. Of course we have no record of that, whether it happened or what was said. Obviously artistic license is being taken in these relationships and these dynamics and these conversations. And if that genuinely bothers you, don't watch the show, because you should know that going in.
I think I agree to you to a point. Yes, a license has to be taken. We had no cameras in the dining room table when Charles and Diana were discussing certain aspects of their marriage. But we can kind of, within a certain understanding, allow for that kind of exposition to unfold within kind of a narrative that is true. But in the case of Charles building a coalition to try to pressure the Queen to abdicate, I did struggle with that because there's no evidence of that to me. And here's the counterpoint. There are so many real things that I thought were ignored in this time period that I would have found much more interesting that were real. I would have loved, I mean, yes, I'm a little biased about the Hong Kong issue because we're from Hong Kong. I would have loved more Hong Kong. But we're dealing with the ending of the empire and the ramifications of psychologically, how is that affecting the royals? How is that affecting this? You know, all they ended up having at one point is a discussion around the table. Well, who's going to go to Hong Kong? But you can't send the Queen. You only do the Queen when you're taking a place, not when you're giving it back. Oh, send Charles. Do I have to go, mummy? You know, it's like, this is the biggest, this is the last imperial possession of any worth. This is the end of empire. Every media organization was talking about the transfer of Hong Kong being the end of the British Empire, but it's treated as if it's like, by the way, we can get away for 2 weeks vacation when that's over. And I would have liked more, forget making up stuff, which I found uninteresting. And if it's not real, it's even less interesting. And to be frank, we haven't really seen much of the British Empire's retreat in previous seasons. You know, Africa from the 50s on, it would be slight mention here or there, but and not that that has to take a center stage in the narrative of the story, but arguably the Queen presided over the disintegration of the empire and the effect that it has had on not only the royal family, but on the country itself, which I think the country still hasn't quite come to terms with. No. And that by and large is ignored in favor of a lot more soapy issues, soap opera-y issues that I felt were given too much attention in season 5.
I mean, I'm not sure I agree that it's been sort of ignored, because for me, that's been one of the sort of overarching themes of the whole show, has been this contradiction between the rise of arguably our greatest monarch ever and the reign of arguably our greatest monarch ever while at the same time the empire is completely dismantling and our role as a nation on the world stage is collapsing. And I think it's this fascinating kind of contradiction that did play out. And I think
even the Falklands was kind of, I mean, it was touched on a bit, but I mean, that would have been the last season. But again, these major elements like Hong Kong that I think could have been given, like, rather than in season 5 giving a whole episode not to Dodi Fayed, but to Dodi's dad,
Muhammad Al Fayed.
Muhammad Al Fayed. And I just thought that they gave too much real estate in season 5 to a periphery character.
Well, I mean, you see, this is funny because that was one of my favorite episodes. And
it's
actually,
not that the story, well, let me just say, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but I thought the whole relationship with the valet that he got from King Edward, I would love to see a movie of that. That would make for a good movie if they can get enough story out of that. I'm just not sure it needed to be told in this story. To me, it distracted from this story. We're trying to cram different stories into this season. To me, keep the main thing the main thing. It should be the Queen. Charles and Diana obviously were in the 90s, and it was the War of the Whales. But I just thought they got their eye off the ball.
Interesting, because I was going to say that I think the reason why they don't necessarily touch on some of the things that you were talking about as to the extent that you want them to is because at the end of the day, this isn't like a chronicle. This isn't British history. This is the royal family, you know, and this isn't like a series that talks about everything that that Britain got involved in the last sort of 50, 60, 70 years or whatever. This is specifically about the royal family and about the Queen herself. And so you've got and so you might not have a lot to say about sort of the Falklands, for example, or even the handing over of Hong Kong, because the royal family weren't particularly directly involved in it. And there's a risk of going too far off the ball, if you like, if you do just get involved in
Yeah.
sort of political machinations as opposed to how the royal family impacted it. And maybe the point they're trying to make is that they weren't as involved in the situation as perhaps one would want them to be.
But I understand that, and that very well could be the case. And I concede that, yeah, you don't want this to be just a history lesson. But I've read enough memoirs to know that Queen Elizabeth had huge relationships with the Commonwealth leaders from the 50s on. And she was a vital link in maintaining that Commonwealth. The Commonwealth was her baby. And when they would have issues like Mugabe in Zimbabwe, or, the unilateral declaration by the Rhodesian government, or Hong Kong itself, yes, you could do something with the House of Commons. There's going to be the government responses to these things. But you can't tell me those prime ministers are not coming into the Queen, and the Queen giving her perspective from her knowledge of the situations and the effect it's having on her emotionally. I'd much rather her going into the bedroom and talking to Philip, just bemoaning maybe the loss of a territory that she particularly was fond of, over manufactured drama, which arguably probably didn't happen.
Okay, I'm not sure I'm as 100% convinced that it didn't happen as you are about this thing of Charles rallying support, because I do remember that the dialogue certainly being in the press when it was. But I think what we're doing is we're spending a little bit too much time discussing what isn't in the show and what the show isn't, as opposed to perhaps talking about what the show is and what it does and what it does cover. And talking about prime ministers and their relationship with the Queen, I thought John Major, I thought it was a really interesting take on him, actually, because my memory of John Major as a prime minister was that he was boring. He was grey. Spitting Image is this very popular sort of political satire show where they use puppets in the UK that has been going off so long. And I remember his puppet was just grey, and he was sort of completely boring, and that was kind of his overwhelming characteristic, albeit the fact that he was from Brixton. But they give him a lot more sort of dynamism in this show. He's courted by Charles, but then his relationship with the Queen becomes actually quite sort of quite close, and it's one of the things I think the show has done well is these relationships between the Queen and her prime ministers at specific moments, and not least the fact that it was Jonny Lee Miller playing John Major, which is fascinating because I think for many people Jonny Lee Miller is most famous for being Sick Boy in Trainspotting, which obviously came out while I'm pretty sure John Major was still prime minister at the time, and you could not have envisioned a character less like John Major than this sort of bleach blonde haired Scottish heroin addict running rampant in Edinburgh. Indeed. And just the very notion that 30 years later that character would be playing John Major is it just tickled me, and he was great as well.
I totally agree. The whole scene where he's playing the negotiator between Charles and Diana, and he's trying to explain things, I just thought, wow. I had the same exact thought. I thought, if John Major was anything like this, I think he's been in hindsight, I think history has shown that he's been an underappreciated prime minister, coming out of the shadow of Margaret Thatcher and kind of being bookended between Tony Blair on one side and Margaret Thatcher. He probably didn't get the attention he deserved. And yet I think in hindsight, as I think Peter Morgan highlights in this series, there was a lot more to John Major than maybe we gave him credit for.
Yeah, and it's been great to sort of see that realization play out, actually. And it is the show that's done that for me.
Well, and I also think this show, not just season 5, but all 5 seasons, Peter Morgan is pretty sympathetic to the royals. I mean, he digs a little dirt. He has to cover the things he has to cover, but he really tries to bookend that with highlighting some noble aspect. I mean, I thought he did it in this maybe a little too hard on the nose, but kind of juxtapositioning the tampon gate episode with his Prince's Trust and all the money that he's raised for disadvantaged youth, and it's got him kind of dancing, with the young people, and it's almost like, Peter Morgan saying, sorry, we gotta cover these topics, so let's balance it off and let's give a little sugar with the medicine.
Yeah, I mean, clearly, he is. He has a favorable opinion of the monarchy.
Yeah.
That the fact that this show exists, and but I think it is a kind of conflicted relationship, which I think is Britain's relationship with the royal family. It is very much like family, like being part of a family. They might irritate you or do stupid things that you can't ignore, and upset you from time to time, but at the end of the day you're stuck with them, and you have to kind of love them to some degree, and I think he strikes that balance, whether he's inventing scenarios or not. I think he strikes that balance very well between affection and criticism, I think. But I do want to say that I think, because obviously this is one of those change up seasons where the whole it's all recast. This is season 5, and so we've got an entirely new cast, and I think across the board they are pretty fantastic, actually. Imelda Staunton and Jonathan Pryce. I think Dominic West as Charles is phenomenal. Elizabeth Debicki as Diana, at a time when I think the media's been pretty oversaturated with depictions of Diana recently, and I think it must have been really hard for her coming hot on the heels of Kristen Stewart and other people. And Emma Corrin in the previous season, and then who was it? Naomi Watts before that. It feels like we've been watching Diana a lot. Versions of Diana, in the same way that I remember when the first season of The Crown came out, and you had John Lithgow playing Churchill. That kind of came at a time when there seemed to be a lot of depictions of Churchill. It was around the same time that Gary Oldman was doing it, and Brian Cox were doing it on the big screen as well. And you were like, oh, here we go, another Churchill. And they all managed to make it different. But I felt Debicki's portrayal of Diana, perhaps because it's the Diana that we know and that we're most familiar with, it's the Diana that really was in the public eye. And so there was probably a lot more material to draw from, but I thought she absolutely nailed it in a way that none of those who came before her came close to.
I agree. I was alive, and I watched those interviews live, and I've subsequently have seen the clips over the years, and she nails that. And I'll concur on the rest of the cast too. Dominic West, I think they're doing Charles a big favor there, because I don't think Charles quite is in that category of Dominic West. But who I really particularly like and didn't get utilized as much as I would have liked, and perhaps it's because he's taking more of a back seat, is Jonathan Pryce playing Prince Philip. One, I love the cattiness of Prince Philip. Lean into that, baby. In season 6, I want to hear more gaffs. I want to hear the unfiltered Philip. Give me unfiltered Phil is what I want. And Jonathan Pryce, I love that guy. I have been a fan since I saw him in Something Wicked This Way Comes back in the mid 80s. And I saw him live here before COVID. The Royal Shakespeare Company did a performance of Merchant of Venice here in Hong Kong about four years ago. And Jonathan Pryce played Shylock. And at the end, when they force convert him to Christianity, it's so painful. I'm in the audience and I'm getting chills. He just portrayed it so well. A little off tangent, just to say I'm a huge Jonathan Pryce fan, so I was so happy when I saw that he was cast, and I would like to see more of him in season 6.
Yeah, I mean, because the memories I have, certainly growing up, of Prince Philip is, oh god, what did he come out with this time?
Yes.
What did he inappropriate thing did he say to an African leader or an Asian leader? Because and there was always something, and it was always reprehensible. But it was, as a teenager growing up, it was also always hilarious. And so you're like, oh god, what's he said? And so it would be remiss, I think, if they don't get a few more of those in.
Lean into it. Peter, lead into it. It's interesting. Tammy, obviously I watched this with my wife, and one of the first things that my wife said was she didn't like Imelda Staunton as Elizabeth as much as she enjoyed Olivia
Coleman.
Thank you. Olivia Colman and Claire Foy. And when Imelda Staunton as Elizabeth has that dialogue with Diana, when Diana lets her know that she's going to do this interview, and she did the interview and it's going to come out, and wanted to give her the first, let her know before she read about it. That whole dialogue. And after that was over, I looked over at my wife and I said, so do you like Imelda Staunton as Elizabeth? So do you like Imelda Staunton as Elizabeth a little more now? She's like, yeah, it was pretty good.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's always difficult, any of these shows, where they recast the role. It takes a little while for them to, for you as a viewer to kind of get comfortable with it. It's like with a new Bond or a new Doctor Who. Yeah. Or something like that. It happens a lot, but it's always a period of adjustment. But yeah, I don't think it takes too long before you forget that you're watching Imelda Staunton and that actually who you're watching is the Queen.
And I'm sure day one in heaven, Elizabeth had her David Tennant moment. She looked and she was Claire Foy and went, "Oh, this is great. I'm young."
Well, yeah, that's it. Yeah. But I mean, I've always liked the show when it does these sort of weird sort of I think what you'd call them is sort of bottle episodes in normal TV. They call them where it kind of goes off on a little bit of a tangent, because all through The Crown there have been episodes like that where they've touched on like a little event that happened in history that I knew nothing about. Like I remember in the first season there's this whole episode about this incredible fog that rolls into London and it cripples the city, and I was like, I've never heard about this. Or there's the Welsh mining town with the landslide that got completely kind of covered, and I remember something about that, but I felt that there's an episode in this season, and it is the Muhammad Al-Fayed episode, I think, and it takes you a little while before you even realize what's going on, or why are they showing us this, or who are these characters. And I get it. It's the story of a guy who essentially targeted, gave himself a mission. He was like, I want to be in with the royal family. I want to be British royalty, or and he's just this sort of merchant from the Middle East. It's like you're never gonna get there, but it's how he did. And obviously the end game is going to be Dodie hooking up with Diana. But I thought it was fascinating. I didn't know about his manservant, that he had Edward VIII's manservant, but it makes perfect sense. It all aligns sort of beautifully. It's that kind of sort of fanboy fanaticism almost that he had. That's the kind of legitimacy that would give him the legitimacy that he felt that he needed in order to sort of stand by their side and go toe to toe with them.
And it's interesting, that post-colonial thought too, because that is a certain expression in a lot of post-colonial colonies. I remember reading a Robert Mugabe memoir, or not a memoir, he didn't write it, but a biography on Mugabe. And he was much the same way. Even though he would be antagonistic to Great Britain, he would often say it is the pinnacle of human civilization. He would dress as the Brits. He wanted to be British, and one of his biggest desires was to be recognized by Britain, like to have some kind of recognition. And you're wondering why somebody who had been spending so much time fighting against colonialists really still wants to emulate the colonizer. And it's a fascinating, I don't have a great answer for that, but it's not a unique situation that Muhammad Al-Fayed, this is something that occurs in many of these countries.
Well, I think you saw it with Trump. I think that he wanted to be taken seriously as a world leader when he came in, and when the sort of the nice world leaders refused to take him seriously, he gravitated towards these other sort of strong men who had been marginalized, but he felt that he probably had more in common with. And obviously it was the first time that any of them had the recognition from the USA that they wanted. And so they found sort of this affinity, with like Kim Jong-un and with like Duterte in the Philippines. And to a
Saudi
degree,
Arabia,
Putin, I suppose. Yeah, and the Saudi guy as well. And so they were kind of like, we'll be outsiders together. And Trump saw that he had an opportunity to sort of legitimize them, who in turn would reciprocate. And in a way that sort of the EU leaders weren't doing,
Yeah.
or Trudeau wasn't doing, or whomever. And so no. So I totally get it. And I thought it was an interesting way of showing that here. And I think the other interesting episode in terms of a chapter of history that's probably underreported was the whole chapter about the Russian royal family and the mass grave, and when Yeltsin came in and there was a regime change in Russia, they reached out and said, well, we can do this for you. And I thought it was ironic that it turns out that it's Philip who has more more royal blood than the Queen does.
Yeah,
it was
I
his DNA that helped identify them.
Yeah, I enjoyed that episode. And like yourself, that was news to me. What I found was depressing is knowing the Russian-Ukraine war going on and realizing that trajectory that Russia was on was going to be short-lived. And I found it depressing watching that episode, knowing where Russia was heading.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
So what did you think of how they portrayed the Hong Kong situation and the whole handover?
I mean, I think, to a degree like you, I think I would have liked more, just a longer conversation about how that kind of negotiation went. But I guess the point is that it was a negotiation between politicians and the Chinese government. It wasn't a conversation that was had with the royal family. And I think, the way it's portrayed is that the royal family were really just sort of there just to cut the ribbon, or just to wave it off, and they weren't really involved in it, which was a shame. I mean, obviously, living in Hong Kong, you want to see a major event like that covered in more detail, but I think it's one of those elements where I was like, well, I guess really the royal family weren't all that involved in it.
Yeah. I do remember, though, because I was there for it. And so I was able to pick out the little things they got wrong, like condensing. The rain was right, but there was no mainland Chinese delegation there. That happened later at the exhibition center. That Tamar parade was purely the British and the locals who were kind of part of the British structure. But I remember people forget that the whole Charles and Diana thing in the mid-90s, people really sided with Diana. She hadn't passed away yet. It was only like 3 weeks or a month or so after the handover.
It was exactly 2 months later.
That she died. But his PR was really bad. I mean, everybody put her here, him down here. And I remember thinking, wow, I was not a Charles fan. But then when I saw him in the rain delivering that speech, and I remember saying to the people we're watching this live with, if that had been American, he would have had to make some silly comment about the rain. But it wasn't a light drizzle. If you go on YouTube and you watch it, it is just pouring on him. I come as a representative of Her Majesty the Queen. And he does this whole thing. And I remember thinking, well done, Charles. You did that really well. Good kudos on that. And that started, I think, at least in my mind and a lot of people's minds, a restoration of his possibilities, of his potential. And I think subsequently history has shown that where Diana was here and he was here in people's favorability, it's kind of balanced out. We realize actually she had a lot of baggage and a lot of issues, and she could be playing the media and a bit of a manipulator, so let's call it 50-50 and leave it there.
Are we gonna rate this? Are we gonna give it a score? I think
we should. Yeah, I guess we should. It's a series, and you caught me off balance there. What instrument should we be using as a measurement for its greatness, James? Oh, I know right where you're going. And this is
Oh no, I wasn't going there. No,
I was going there. When you started laughing, I was going there.
I was going to go with something a little bit more respectable. But okay. How about defunct, falling into disrepair HMS Britannia's? That's
it. Well, then how many falling into disrepair HMS Britannia? It's Britannia.
Yes,
Britannia. Yeah. It's not Britannica. It's not the encyclopedias. It's
Britannia.
It's Britannia.
Yes, which I think is used as a great metaphor for for the Queen and for the royal family. It's just, I mean, I thought this was great. I mean, I am able to kind of like let go and just let it play out as a kind of soap opera, and you know, that has a lot of truth in it, and approach it that way round, rather than I'm looking for the truth and I get upset by whatever. And this season I think was particularly strong. I think the cast are uniformly excellent. I thought it touched on some interesting areas. You know, there's an inevitability to it somewhat, because you know where it's going. You know that obviously it's going to all dovetail into what happens to Diana, and I think they leave it on an interesting kind of cliffhanger that, you know, you're just weeks away from that happening. And I know that it's going to get everybody tuning in for the next season. So I thought this was one of the stronger seasons, actually, in my opinion. And you know, maybe that's because I am more familiar with those events, but I just felt that it was really sort of firing on all cylinders, and it addressed some interesting sort of topics and themes about just the royal family's role in British society and how they were up against the wall. So I'm going to give this season 4 scuttled Britannias out of 5.
Sounds good, James. I liked it a little less than you. I think that came across. I'm not looking for truth per se. I just thought the Liberty line got stretched a little too far in this one. It got a little too soap opera for me, as opposed, I felt, than earlier seasons. The cast is spectacular, as you mentioned. It's just, I think this is the strongest cast of any of the seasons, and so on that front, I really appreciated it. Although I found many of the episodes interesting, I found it unfocused. I found, like I mentioned, I'm not so sure you needed to dedicate a whole episode to Dodi's dad. I know that they're setting it up for the future, but I would have liked that real estate of time focused on other aspects of the royals, and there was plenty going on that they could have focused on. So, not to belabor this, because this has already gone on long enough, I'm going to give this 3.5 scuttled Britannias. Definitely well worth the watch. You should be watching it, but I think I would have given previous seasons 4 and 4.5. So
fair enough.
That's James. Yeah, well, that's James and I's thoughts on season 5 of The Crown. But what's yours? It has been a little controversial. A lot of people talking about this, and obviously James and I have had some fairly strong opinions. We haven't always agreed. Do you agree with us? Do you disagree? Do you have a completely other perspective? We would love to engage you in the comment section below. And just as a reminder, we're on Twitter and on Instagram. You can follow those links as well in the description box below. James?
Yeah, let us know what you think of The Crown. Are you still watching it? You know, who are your favorite incarnations of these characters? Which episodes of British history were not covered or were covered that you would like to see featured? Season 6, obviously it's going to cover Princess Diana's death, but what else would you like to see in there? Let us know in the comments.
You know, it's got to start in episode 1 of season 6, because there's only 2 months between those events, Hong Kong's handover and the Queen or Princess Di's death. So it's got to go right into it.
I think they got to get straight into it.
Well, until next episode.
You're wonderful to see. You ought to be in pictures all